capacity, reserves, and institutions that overlap. One of the big problems with the New Orleans disaster in the US was that you had all these different institutions that were dealing with bits of the problem, and there were gaps in the middle. And so things got missed, and in some areas people didn't know who was responsible for them. So they're all the things we need, and if you look down that list, you can see that in many ways our society is busily reducing all of those at the moment. The more efficient we try to be economically, the less diversity we have. In many countries we shut down openness of ideas. In our education systems, if there's one university that's teaching a particular course these days, we shut down that course in all the other universities because we don't want two universities doing the same thing, and stuff like that. I'll say something about adaptability and transformability on the next slide, because coming from that, a whole lot of research has been done about how do ecosystems, how do social systems get resilience, and what are the sorts of things that we can learn from the past by looking at systems that have had resilience or not had it. And the lessons that come out are a little bit confronting. The first lesson is the one I've already said. We can't think about resilience as just staying the same. And of course we need to think about complex interactions and systems. I've said all that. And we need to think about multiple scales. The next one's a bit surprising. It turns out when you look at systems, sometimes resilience is general. You can have resilience to deal with a whole range of things. Sometimes if there's a specific challenge, there's a certain set of qualities that you need to deal with that specific challenge. It turns out that very rarely can you have a system that's resilient to a whole range of things, but also resilient to a few specific things. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. So if you're trying to, say, build a resilient country, you could put a lot of effort into be resilient against an invasion from Indonesia, for example, but be very vulnerable to a disease outbreak, just as a really wild sort of idea. Getting resilience usually requires that the system finds its own place and organises itself. And this is really confronting to policymakers because they solve problems usually by imposing a solution. And the research is suggesting that won't work. The more you impose a solution on a system, the less resilient it'll be. And I guess the other interesting thing is that resilience is not always desirable. It's obvious when I mention it, but there are many systems around the place we want to change. Take our health system. People have been trying to change our health system or our taxation system for years and years, and every time you try and change it, it just bounces back. It's got huge resilience, but it's not the resilience that we want. So quite often, understanding resilience is about understanding it so you can break it down. Yeah. And then the last point is that really it's no point talking about resilience unless you also talk about adaptability and transformability, because sometimes you'll be in a system where you realise it's not working and you need to transform into something else rather than just stay the same. So staying the same is not always good. So there's some insights into complexity that, as I say, are fairly confronting. Now, I'm running out of time. I don't want to cut into your time to ask questions. So I'm going to skip over this section now on constraints. I'll deal with it fairly quickly. One of the things that stops us applying these sort of techniques is people not wanting to give up power. This example, if you want to read more about it, if you go to this publication, Brighter Prospects, and there's a really nice article by Graham Marshall where he's saying that we've essentially realised that the way to deal with complex issues like climate change is to involve the whole of society in decision making. Some people are closer to particular problems and can deal with them better than others, and we need to devolve that power. Governments have kind of experimented with that over the last couple of decades, but they always keep pulling back to central control because they're really nervous about letting go. So that's one of the sort of forces that can pull us back from trying to make the decisions that might work. And bear in mind, we don't know what will work, so we need to experiment, but we're very reluctant to experiment. I mentioned earlier that we often neglect implications and we end up with perverse policy outcomes. This was just the example of the US requiring biofuels in gasoline and ending up causing the closing down of food production in some parts of the world because you could make more money by producing biofuels than producing food. There's lots of examples like that. This is an interesting example. This is a depiction by an artist who was asked in 1895 to depict the living room of the year 2000. And that's what they came up with. It illustrates how difficult we find it to imagine social change. It's always a real difficulty for us. As specialists, we're more aware of what can't happen than what can happen. So this fellow was the president of the Royal Society, one of the world's leading scientists in the late 1800s. He could see all the reasons why these things couldn't happen and couldn't see why they could happen. And similarly, the US Air Force, when confronted with the possibility that they might be able to get something orbiting within 5 years, this was in 1953, they said, no, not possible. And as for putting someone on the moon, year 2000, no sooner. Well, of course, they did get something in orbit within 5 years, and they had people on the moon by 1969, but they were aware of what couldn't happen rather than what could happen, and we're all vulnerable to that. Look, I will take a moment to explain this. This is computing power. From back when computing was a pencil and paper, to mechanical devices, through to computers, and it's expressed as calculations per second, or calculations per second or something like that, and it's normalised to what would be an affordable computer. Now what it shows is that computing power is doubling, has been doubling every 15 months for a long time. By about 2001 we had affordable computers with the processing capacity of a spider's brain. The prediction is that by about 2030 we'll have computers that process faster than the human brain. And this brings about what futurists call singularity, a time when change is so major and so rapid that we just can't imagine what implications it'll have. So you can come up with all sorts of interesting possibilities, like downloading human brains into computers, and that brings up social problems like what rights does that computer have and what rights does the body have? Are they equal? But the point is that there are aspects of the future that are so complex that we just cannot imagine what they might do. But at least by imagining the possibilities, we're better prepared than if we ignore them. And then there's fields of psychology that look at the way people make decisions. Behavioural economics is one area that looks at the way people make decisions and concludes that basically we make irrational decisions. And some of the reading that I've given you is about a number of those thinking flaws. Really irrational things that we do that are part of our decision-making process. So I encourage you to have a look at those and discuss them in the tutorial. And the last comment I want to make really is that you'll get various views of complexity through this course. And I'd encourage you to ask, how do they help us deal with complexity? You know, you had the lecture last week about economic crises. What insights did you get from that help you to deal with that sort of complexity in the future? And particularly, how do they help us identify and avoid these unhelpful attitudes that we've got that just make it harder? And one way to do that is to ask yourself, what would you do if you ruled the world? So and this picture is just to get you thinking about the consequences of not thinking ahead, you know. And finally, this is a slide that's not on your things. It's a bit of a plug for this publication that we did at Australia 21. We got a group of people from around Australia together, or a group of experts, and asked them to think about how we might prepare better for surprise in the future. It's a very imperfect document, but it's an interesting starting point to think about some of these issues.